Russia Tomorrow.
Hello, and thank you for being with us today. First of all, there is an interview by Mr. Zaluzhny, one of the commanders of Ukrainian army, and also another interview published just recently of Mr. Podolyak from the President's Office of Ukraine. And they have a common prospects of this war. Both of them are saying that Russia will start a new offensive by spring. How would you evaluate the statements, and would you agree?
So, of course, General Zaluzhny has a lot more useful intelligence than I would have. So his assessment is important. And there's no doubt that Russian forces would like to create a diversion, something from the direction of Belarus or other parts to the north, that would draw away Ukrainian forces from what they're doing now in Donetsk and Luhansk. So I expect the Russians will attempt to do something like that. The key will be whether or not, number one, Lukashenko goes along with it, and in what way. I don't think he wants to fight Ukrainian soldiers because he knows his own troops will be destroyed very quickly. Number two, how quickly can the Russians build up meaningful capability, more than just bodies from recently mobilized troops? I'm skeptical of that.
So Zaluzhny says Russia is preparing a new group of soldiers consisting of 200,000 men. And do you think that this amount of people would be sufficient? And do you think that this amount of people could change anything on the front?
Well, the Russians, of course, are doing their best to draw out this conflict as long as they can, in hopes that the West will lose the will to continue support, and also to grind down Ukraine's ability to continue to fight. So they have no problem trading bodies for time. Untrained soldiers, recently mobilized, pushing them in. They're prisoners wherever they come from. I mean, we've seen that already. And even though they lose hundreds of these untrained soldiers, it still takes a toll on Ukrainian forces and on Ukrainian logistics. So it is a challenge, but again, it's not going to change the outcome of the war. It may prolong it, but it's not going to change it. And I also I don't think that the Russians have repaired their logistics system enough to be able to properly recruit and equip 200,000 more soldiers. You remember back in September, 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country to avoid being mobilized. So they don't have unlimited amounts of manpower.
You have mentioned the outcome of the war. Do you see it? How do you see it?
Well, I believe that war is a test of will, and it's a test of logistics. It's clear that Ukrainian people have superior will. It's clear that Ukrainian soldiers have superior will. The will that really matters now is the will of the Kremlin versus the will of the West to continue this. That's an important aspect of this conflict. I believe we do. I hear that from my president. I hear that from other European leaders. And so I believe that that will advantage is still on the side of Ukraine. The logistics situation for Ukraine gets a little bit better. It's a challenge, but it gets a little bit better each week. And for the Russians, their logistics system is under enormous pressure, especially if Ukraine continues to attack Russian logistics, Russian ammunition, Russian transportation. This is very skillful execution by the Ukrainian General Staff. My sense is that Crimea should be liberated by next summer.
By next summer?
Right. I would say by the end of August, September, Ukraine will have achieved the conditions necessary to put long-range fire into Crimea, making it untenable for the Russians. The two logistics routes that go into Crimea over the Kerch Bridge and along the through Mariupol and Melitopol are both already under pressure from Ukraine. And it will be very difficult for Russian forces to reinforce or resupply in Crimea.
But General Hodges, we can hear and we can see the reactions of the Russian side on anything that is connected to Crimea. This is something spiritual, maybe even for Vladimir Putin, as you may know. Of course, you know that. So don't you think that if there is a threat of losing Crimea for Putin, he would push the button and then he would use the nuclear weapon?
No, I do not.
Why not?
You are correct in that Crimea has a special strategic significance. I mean, that's why Catherine the Great annexed it back at the end of the 18th century. But this is sovereign Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is not going to ask them to leave, the Russians to leave. You're going to have to compel Russian forces to leave through the use of force, which I believe is possible. Now, this is not happening in a vacuum. I think if Russia continues to suffer the way it is, if Russian forces continue to suffer huge losses, the Russian economy continues to be so severely damaged, then what's going on inside the Kremlin and in Moscow is another factor that will affect this. And I think that President Putin, Mr. Prigozhin, Mr. Kadyrov, and all the others are thinking about what comes next for them. And so to use a nuclear weapon over Crimea, of course it's possible. And of course we take it seriously. But I think it's so unlikely because it will not give the Russians any sort of advantage. My president has been very clear that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, there will be catastrophic consequences for Russian forces. And I think the Kremlin believes it. I think the Russian general staff believes it. And I think that these people are anticipating life after Putin as well. This is why I think it's unlikely.
And when you talk about the long-range weapons, missiles, I would remind our viewers that according to Washington Post, recently they have published an article saying that there is a quiet authorization from the US government to Ukrainians to strike on Russian territories. Do you think this is possible? Is it likely that there is such an authorization that Kiev has got from Washington? And if yes, what would be the threats connecting to that, or there are no such threats in your opinion?
Well, first of all, let's be clear that Ukraine as a sovereign country can always do anything to defend itself. All right, that's always been the case. And we've seen that Ukraine has launched drone strikes against Russian air bases, which I think they ought to do, because this is where so many of the cruise missiles and rockets are coming from. Having said that, I can understand that the U.S. or that the President Zelensky's administration would be concerned that if they did this without some sort of endorsement from the United States, that other support might be cut off. I don't think that will happen. I do hope that my president's administration has given a strong endorsement to Kyiv to say, do what you need to do, and we will continue to try to find capabilities to help you.
So what do you think the development of Russian activity and Ukrainians' activity may be before the end of the year? Should we expect something?
Well, I think that the Ukrainian General Staff is going to continue to pound away at Russian logistics and Russian headquarters wherever they can find them. They'll want to keep the pressure on Russian forces to not give them the chance to build up or recover. And then I think as soon as the ground is hard enough, then I think we may see a resumption of more offensive operation.
And is there more weaponry in the West for Ukraine? We have heard the statements made by different European politicians saying that there are some lack of weapons already because everything has been sent to Ukraine already.
Well, certainly, all of us have given an awful lot of our own capabilities, provided that to Ukraine, which is exactly what we should be doing. I just read this morning that even the Dutch have reached €1 billion in terms of aid that the Netherlands has provided. So I think the Pentagon is looking everywhere to find what else can be provided. We're trying to increase our own ammunition production. We were unprepared for this. All of us, including Ukraine, had not anticipated the amount of ammunition required, the missile defense requirements, and now we are all working hard to generate the capability that is needed, not only for Ukraine, but for other deterrence requirements as well.
And what about Patriots? We can see that there is some confusion in Washington about delivering it to Ukraine. First, we have seen this, the publication of New York Times saying that it's almost done and the Patriots would be sent to Ukraine. Then we have seen the articles about Biden's hesitation, if I can call it hesitation. What is that?
Well, I would not say that that's confusion in Washington. I would say this is what we call conflicting reports by different journalists based on what they hear and what they think. So my sense is that the administration is looking for ways to do this. I believe it's going to happen. But it's also important to keep in mind that Patriot, which is the best in the world at what it does, is not a panacea. It's not one missile that can shoot down everything. You wouldn't use it that way. It would have to be incorporated into a broader missile defense network. And the Ukrainian General Staff will have to determine what is the priority for protection, because this is a system that is not standalone by itself. You have to use other weapons to protect against drones. You have to use a combination of systems to protect populations and critical infrastructure. Nonetheless, it will be a very good capability. I just don't know how much will be provided.
The last thing, we have slightly talked about the prospects of this war and the spring, which may be even crucial for the future of Ukraine and for the future of Russia. But as a general, as a person with such a huge experience, could you give us some, insight? How do you see the next steps by both sides? Like, what would be the Russia's target, the next target, or maybe is there a next city or region or town that Ukraine will liberate in the coming months, if you see that prospects?
Yeah, I think the next 2 months, the General Staff is going to be working hard to set the conditions for the final decisive phase, which is the liberation of Crimea. So that means building up logistics, building up forces, keeping an eye on what might be coming out of Belarus to make sure that does not become a problem, but continue focusing on the logistics and the headquarters of Russian forces in and around Crimea, in the area between Kherson and Melitopol, because that is the decisive terrain. That is what's decisive, is regaining control of Crimea, because it will be very difficult for Ukraine to ever be fully secure as long as Russia controls Crimea.
But is there still a chance that Moscow takes Kiev in spring or in any prospect?
I would say there's a chance they will try, but yeah. I cannot imagine any real feasible possibility that they would be successful.
And when they bombed this power grids in Ukraine, does this have a military effect, or it's just psychological effect? Ukrainians are freezing, and it's so complicated, so difficult to be in the middle of the winter without electricity and so on and so forth. I mean, what are the military goals of Russia bombing this power grids?
So we know from history that bombing populations almost never works to change the will. I mean, it didn't work against the Brits. It did not work against the Germans. It didn't work against most populations. But I think there are two reasons they are doing it. Number one is to damage Ukraine's ability for production, to run the trains, to do all the things necessary for the conduct of the war. And so going after the power grid has that effect. And then number two, it is to make the cities untenable during the winter in hopes that thousands of Ukrainians will head west into Europe as refugees, which would put pressure on European capitals to put pressure on Kyiv. So those are the two reasons for doing it, attacking the will of the West and attacking the ability of Ukraine to continue to conduct operations.
And is it successful?
So far, no.
Okay. Thank you very much, General Hodges.
TV Rain is on the air. For 12 years, we remained the only independent news channel in Russia. We had to leave, forced out of the country by new repressive laws after the first week of the war. Our freedom crushed by the authorities.
Мы приняли решение, что мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We have operated as a European company from Europe and now also broadcast in English.
Kherson has surrendered.
Russia's propaganda targets have changed.
Putin cries havoc. We want to tell you firsthand what is really happening in Russia. Subscribe to TV Rain Newsroom on YouTube and let's take a look at our future together.